The mystery of the vanished village of Anjikuni is one of Canada's most enduring legends, a story that has inspired books, documentaries, and countless late-night discussions for nearly a century. Set against the frozen wilderness of northern Canada, it tells of an entire Inuit settlement that allegedly disappeared without leaving behind any clear explanation. Unlike many famous unsolved mysteries that revolve around a single missing person or unexplained death, this tale claims that dozens of people vanished at once, leaving behind an abandoned village that looked as though life had simply stopped in the middle of an ordinary day. Whether fact or folklore, the story has become deeply woven into Canadian mystery culture. The events are said to have taken place in November 1930 near Lake Anjikuni, a remote body of water in what is now Nunavut. At the time, the region was one of the most isolated places on Earth, covered in vast stretches of snow and ice for much of the year. Small Inuit communities lived by hunting caribou, fishing beneath frozen lakes, and surviving in an environment where preparation meant the difference between life and death. Travelers passing through the area were rare, and communication with the outside world was extremely limited. It was in this harsh setting that a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle reportedly made a discovery that would become legendary. According to the popular story, LaBelle had traveled to the village several times before during his trapping expeditions. The settlement was familiar to him, and he expected to find its residents welcoming him as they had on previous visits. As he approached, however, he immediately noticed something was wrong. No smoke drifted from the chimneys despite the freezing temperatures. No dogs barked. No children played outside. The village was completely silent. Curious and increasingly uneasy, LaBelle entered the settlement expecting to find people sheltering inside their homes. Instead, every cabin appeared deserted. The story claims that meals sat untouched on tables, as though families had suddenly stood up in the middle of dinner and never returned. Cooking pots allegedly remained over cold fires, clothing hung where it had been left, and valuable hunting rifles still leaned against walls. For experienced hunters living in the Arctic, abandoning firearms would have been almost unthinkable, since rifles were essential for obtaining food and protecting against predators. This detail would later become one of the most repeated elements of the legend because it suggested that the villagers had left in extreme haste or under mysterious circumstances. As LaBelle searched further, the mystery supposedly deepened. Accounts claimed that he found sled dogs tied to their posts, having died from starvation because no one had returned to feed them. In an environment where sled dogs were vital for transportation and survival, leaving them behind seemed incomprehensible. Some versions even described the dogs still harnessed, waiting for owners who would never return. The silence of the village, combined with the tragic image of starving animals, created an atmosphere that sounded more like a horror novel than a historical event. The most chilling claim involved the village cemetery. According to later retellings, LaBelle discovered that graves had been opened and the bodies were missing. The disturbed burial ground suggested something far stranger than an ordinary evacuation. Stories quickly spread that someone, or something, had removed the dead along with the living. This detail fueled decades of supernatural speculation, leading many to imagine ghostly forces, curses, or unknown visitors responsible for the disappearance. However, historians would later question whether this part of the story had ever been documented by anyone who actually visited the site. Alarmed by what he had allegedly seen, LaBelle reportedly traveled to a nearby telegraph station and contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The legend says officers immediately launched an investigation, searching the surrounding wilderness for tracks, campsites, or any indication of where the villagers had gone. Yet according to the popular version, no footprints leading away from the settlement could be found despite the snow. Searchers supposedly found no signs of struggle, no evidence of attack by animals, and no clues explaining why everyone had vanished at once. It was as though the entire community had simply disappeared into thin air. As newspapers began publishing the story, it spread rapidly across North America. Each retelling introduced new details, making the mystery even more dramatic. Some reports claimed strange blue lights had been seen in the sky around the time of the disappearance. Others suggested enormous unidentified objects hovered above the village before the residents vanished. These additions transformed what may have begun as a strange local tale into one of the earliest stories associated with UFOs and paranormal activity. Over time, Theories expanded to include extraterrestrial abduction, ancient curses, portals to another world, and mysterious Arctic creatures. Yet when modern researchers began examining the historical evidence, cracks started appearing in the story. Historians searched for official RCMP investigation files describing an abandoned village, but found none matching the dramatic accounts. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police later stated that many of the sensational details, including the starving sled dogs and emptied graves, could not be verified through their records. Researchers also discovered that many newspaper articles repeated one another without citing first-hand sources, suggesting the story may have grown larger each time it was retold. Another important discovery was that there may never have been a permanent Inuit village at the exact location described. Inuit communities in the region often moved seasonally, following migrating animals and changing weather conditions. What outsiders viewed as a deserted village may simply have been a temporary camp that had already been abandoned according to normal seasonal practices. This explanation would account for empty shelters without requiring an extraordinary disappearance. Some historians believe Labelle may have misunderstood what he found, while others argue that journalists later exaggerated his account to create a sensational headline. The legend also reflects the limited understanding many Southern Canadians had of Arctic life during the early 20th century. Because so little information traveled from the far north, dramatic stories were difficult to verify and often accepted without question. The remoteness of the region allowed myths to flourish, and newspapers eager for attention frequently favored exciting narratives over careful fact-checking. In the decades that followed, writers embellished the mystery even further, adding supernatural elements that were absent from the earliest reports. Despite these doubts, the village of Anjikuni remains one of Canada's most famous unexplained stories. For believers, the lack of definitive evidence leaves open the possibility that something extraordinary occurred in the Arctic wilderness nearly a century ago. For skeptics, the mystery serves as a fascinating example of how folklore can grow from a small incident into an international legend through repetition and embellishment. Because the original evidence is so limited and many details remain impossible to verify, the story continues to occupy a unique place somewhere between history, myth, and mystery. Today, the village of Anjikuni is remembered not because investigators uncovered shocking answers, but because no single explanation has ever completely replaced the legend. Whether it began with a misunderstood seasonal migration, an exaggerated newspaper report, or an event that was never accurately recorded, the tale continues to captivate people around the world. It reminds us that in the vast frozen wilderness of northern Canada, where silence stretches for miles and history is often hidden beneath snow and time, some mysteries endure precisely because no one can say with certainty where the truth ends and the legend begins. The murder of 12-year-old Lynne Harper remains one of Canada's most significant unsolved criminal cases, not only because the killer has never been identified, but because the investigation led to one of the country's most controversial wrongful convictions. For decades, the case has been at the center of debates about police investigations, eyewitness testimony, and the reliability of the justice system. Although one innocent person ultimately had his conviction overturned, the identity of the person who took Lynne Harper's life remains unknown, leaving a mystery that has endured for more than 6 decades. The story began on the warm evening of June 9, 1959, in the quiet farming town of Clinton, Ontario. At the time, Clinton was a close-knit community where children often played outdoors until sunset and neighbors knew one another by name. Lynne Harper was a cheerful 12-year-old girl who had spent the day with friends. That evening, she was asked to walk a short distance to pick up her younger brother from a nearby baseball game. It was a simple errand that should have taken only a few minutes, and no one imagined it would be the last time she would be seen alive. As the evening wore on, Lynne failed to return home. Her family initially assumed she had stopped to visit friends or had been delayed somewhere along the route. But as darkness settled over the town, concern quickly turned into panic. Her parents contacted local authorities, and what began as a routine missing person report soon escalated into one of the largest search efforts the community had ever witnessed. Volunteers, police officers, firefighters, and neighbors searched fields, roads, wooded areas, and nearby creeks throughout the night, hoping to find any sign of the missing girl. 2 days later, the search came to a devastating end. Lynne Harper's body was discovered in a wooded area several miles from where she had last been seen. The scene shocked both investigators and residents of Clinton. The young girl had been sexually assaulted and murdered before her body was left hidden among the trees. The brutality of the crime was almost unimaginable for such a peaceful community, and fear spread rapidly throughout the region. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely suddenly kept them close to home, while investigators faced intense pressure to identify the person responsible as quickly as possible. Police soon focused their attention on a local 14-year-old boy named Stephen Truscott. He had been seen riding his bicycle with Lynne earlier that evening, making him one of the last known people to have interacted with her. Investigators questioned him extensively, and as public pressure mounted, the investigation narrowed almost entirely around him. Despite his repeated denials, authorities concluded that he had murdered Lynne after giving her a ride on his bicycle. The case against Stephen Truscott was largely circumstantial. There was no DNA evidence, no confession, no murder weapon, and no eyewitness who saw the crime occur. Instead, prosecutors relied heavily on estimates of the time of death, witness statements, and interpretations of Stephen's movements during the evening. In an era long before modern forensic science became common, these pieces of evidence were presented with considerable confidence. The trial moved at remarkable speed, attracting national attention as newspapers closely followed every development. In September 1959, only months after Lynne's murder, Stephen Truscott was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging, making him one of the youngest people ever sentenced to execution in Canadian history. The verdict stunned the nation. While many believed justice had been served, others questioned whether a 14-year-old could truly have committed such a crime, and whether the evidence presented was sufficient for such a severe sentence. Public debate intensified over the following months. Appeals were filed, legal experts examined the trial, and concerns grew regarding the prosecution's timeline. Eventually, the federal government commuted Stephen Truscott's death sentence to life imprisonment before the execution could be carried out. Although his life had been spared, he spent years behind bars while continuing to insist that he was innocent. Over the following decades, advances in forensic science and renewed examination of the case raised serious questions about the original investigation. Independent researchers, journalists, lawyers, and innocence advocates carefully reviewed witness testimony, police reports, and medical evidence. Many concluded that the estimated time of Lynne Harper's death, which had been central to the prosecution's theory, was far less certain than jurors had been led to believe. If the timeline was incorrect, it became possible that Stephen Truscott could not have committed the murder at all. As doubts continued to grow, the case was eventually referred back to the courts. After an extensive review lasting several years, the Ontario Court of Appeal issued a landmark decision in 2007. The court concluded that Stephen Truscott had suffered a miscarriage of justice and formally acquitted him. Nearly 48 years after his conviction, his name was finally cleared. The ruling marked one of the most significant exonerations in Canadian legal history and became a powerful reminder of how investigative mistakes and uncertain forensic evidence can alter a person's life forever. Yet while Stephen Truscott was officially declared innocent, the court's decision did not identify Lynne Harper's real killer. Instead, it reopened the central mystery that had existed from the very beginning. If Stephen had not committed the crime, then someone else had murdered 12-year-old Lynne Harper and escaped justice entirely. Despite renewed public interest following the acquittal, investigators were unable to identify another suspect with sufficient evidence to bring charges. Over the years, investigators have considered the possibility that an unknown predator happened to cross Lynne's path that evening. Others have suggested that someone familiar with the local area may have been responsible, using knowledge of the surrounding countryside to avoid detection. Unfortunately, many potential witnesses have passed away, memories have faded, and physical evidence collected in 1959 has deteriorated or cannot be examined using modern DNA techniques. These challenges have made solving the case increasingly difficult as time passes. The Lynne Harper investigation also transformed Canadian criminal justice. It prompted important discussions about juvenile defendants, forensic science, eyewitness reliability, disclosure of evidence, and safeguards against wrongful convictions. Law schools continue to study the case, as an example of how legal systems must remain open to correcting past mistakes, even decades later. At the same time, many believe that the focus on Stephen Truscott during the original investigation may have diverted attention away from the true perpetrator during the crucial early stages of the case. The tragedy is remembered not only because a young girl's life was taken far too soon, but because the search for justice became intertwined with one of Canada's greatest legal controversies. Her family never received definitive answers about who killed their daughter, while Stephen Truscott spent nearly half a century fighting to clear his name. The case stands as both a haunting unsolved mystery and a sobering lesson about the importance of thorough investigations, reliable evidence, and the enduring pursuit of justice, even when the truth remains painfully out of reach. The murder of Theresa Allore is one of Canada's most haunting unsolved cold cases, a mystery that has puzzled investigators for decades and raised troubling questions about whether a serial predator may have targeted young women across rural Quebec during the late 1970s. What makes the case particularly compelling is not only the brutal nature of the crime, but also the extraordinary efforts of Theresa's family, especially her younger brother, to uncover the truth after official investigations appeared to stall. More than 4 decades later, despite renewed interest, extensive independent research, and multiple police reviews, no one has ever been charged with her murder. Theresa Allore was a bright, outgoing 19-year-old college student attending Champlain Regional College in Lennoxville, Quebec. Originally from Ontario, she had moved to Quebec to pursue her education and was enjoying the independence that came with college life. Friends described her as friendly, adventurous, and optimistic about her future. Like many students living away from home for the first time, she balanced her studies with an active social life and was looking forward to completing another semester. Nothing in the days leading up to her disappearance suggested that she was in danger. On the evening of Friday, November 3, 1978, Theresa spent time with friends before returning to her residence hall. Witnesses reported seeing her later that night after she left the dormitory, but what happened afterward remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in Canadian criminal history. At some point during the night, Theresa vanished without a trace. When she failed to return and could not be contacted, concern quickly spread among her friends and family. Initially, there was hope that she had simply gone away for a short time, but as the hours turned into days, it became clear that something far more serious had occurred. Police launched a missing person investigation, searching nearby roads, fields, and wooded areas surrounding Lennoxville. The region consisted of quiet rural communities connected by isolated country roads, making searches particularly difficult. Investigators interviewed classmates, professors, and local residents, hoping someone had seen Theresa after she left campus. Unfortunately, no reliable witness could explain where she had gone or who she might have been with during her final hours. Nearly 5 months later, in April 1979, a grim discovery shattered any remaining hope. Theresa's remains were found in a wooded area, along a rural roadside not far from where she had disappeared. The condition of the remains made it difficult for investigators to reconstruct exactly what had happened. Although authorities determined that her death was a homicide, crucial forensic evidence had been lost due to the passage of time and exposure to the elements. The delayed discovery significantly complicated the investigation, leaving detectives with very few physical clues to identify her killer. As investigators attempted to piece together Theresa's final movements, they struggled to establish a clear timeline. There were no known eyewitnesses to the murder, no confirmed murder weapon, and no obvious suspect. The rural location where her body was found suggested that the killer had deliberately chosen an isolated place to avoid detection. Yet despite interviewing numerous individuals connected to the college and surrounding communities, police were unable to develop enough evidence to bring charges against anyone. Over time, the investigation gradually lost momentum. As months turned into years, public attention faded, and Theresa's case became another cold file sitting in police archives. For her family, however, the mystery was far from over. They believed there were unanswered questions that deserved further investigation, and refused to accept that the case would simply remain unsolved. The person who would eventually bring renewed attention to the investigation was Theresa's younger brother, John Allore. Decades after his sister's murder, he began conducting his own exhaustive research into the case. What started as a personal search for answers evolved into one of Canada's most remarkable examples of independent cold case investigation. John interviewed former witnesses, examined forgotten police files, reviewed newspaper archives, and spoke with retired investigators who had worked on the original case. His determination brought fresh public attention to Theresa's murder and encouraged renewed discussion about crimes committed in Quebec during the same period. As John Allore dug deeper, he noticed striking similarities between Theresa's death and several other unsolved attacks involving young women in the eastern townships of Quebec during the 1970s. Many of the victims were students or young women who disappeared under mysterious circumstances before being found murdered in isolated locations. The similarities in victim profiles, geography, and methods led some investigators and researchers to wonder whether a serial offender had been operating in the region without being recognized at the time. This theory gained additional attention because several murders from that era had never been conclusively solved. Some investigators believed that police agencies may have treated each case separately, preventing them from recognizing patterns that might have linked the crimes together. Others argued that forensic limitations during the 1970s made it extremely difficult to identify serial offenders, particularly before DNA profiling became available. Although no definitive connection has ever been established, the possibility that Theresa's killer may have been responsible for other murders remains one of the most discussed aspects of the case. As forensic science advanced, investigators revisited Theresa's murder in hopes that modern technology might reveal new evidence. Cold case specialists re-examined preserved evidence, reviewed witness statements, and compared the case against databases of known offenders. Despite these efforts, the available evidence proved insufficient to identify a suspect conclusively. The passage of more than 4 decades had created significant obstacles. Potential witnesses had died or forgotten important details, physical evidence had deteriorated, and many investigative opportunities available today simply did not exist in 1978. Another challenge has been separating credible information from speculation. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about Theresa's final hours. Some have suggested she accepted a ride from someone she believed she could trust. Others believe she may have encountered a stranger while walking near campus. There have also been suggestions that the killer may have been familiar with the local roads and wooded areas, allowing them to dispose of her body without attracting attention. However, none of these theories has been supported by enough evidence to solve the case. John Allore's relentless pursuit of justice eventually led him to publish his findings, produce podcasts, and work alongside journalists and investigators to keep Theresa's story alive. Rather than allowing the case to fade into history, he transformed it into a symbol of the importance of revisiting cold cases with fresh eyes. His efforts have inspired renewed investigations into other unsolved crimes and demonstrated how determined family members can contribute valuable information, even decades after an investigation has gone cold. Today, the murder of Theresa Allore remains officially unsolved. No arrests have ever been made, no suspect has been publicly identified, and the person responsible has never faced justice. Yet the case continues to be actively discussed by investigators, criminologists, and true crime researchers, because it may represent more than a single unsolved homicide. If the theory of a serial predator operating in Quebec during the late 1970s is ever confirmed, Theresa's case could become the key to solving multiple murders that have remained mysteries for generations. More than 40 years after Theresa Allore disappeared into the cold November night, the questions surrounding her death remain unanswered. Who crossed her path after she left her residence hall? Was she the victim of a lone killer, or part of a larger pattern of violence that authorities failed to recognize at the time? Those answers remain hidden somewhere in the past. Until new evidence emerges, or someone finally comes forward with the missing piece of the puzzle, the murder of Theresa Allore will remain one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case defined by tragedy, perseverance, and an unyielding search for the truth. The disappearance of the Jack family is one of Canada's most heartbreaking unsolved mysteries, a case that involves the unexplained vanishing of an entire family of 4 without a single confirmed sighting ever again. Unlike many missing person investigations that focus on one individual, this case centers on 2 parents and their young children who seemingly vanished together after accepting what appeared to be a promising job opportunity. More than 3 decades later, no bodies have been recovered, no arrests have been made, and investigators continue to believe that the family fell victim to a carefully planned act of foul play. The mystery has become one of British Columbia's most enduring cold cases and serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly trust can be exploited. The family consisted of 26-year-old Ronald Ron Jack, his 26-year-old wife Doreen Jack, and their two sons, 9-year-old Russell and 4-year-old Ryan. They were members of the First Nations community and lived near Prince George, British Columbia. Like many young families, they faced financial challenges and hoped to build a better future for their children. Friends described Ron as hardworking and determined to provide for his family, while Doreen was known as a devoted mother who rarely spent time away from her sons. Those who knew them later said it was almost impossible to imagine the couple willingly abandoning their children or disappearing without contacting relatives. During the summer of 1989, Ron Jack was searching for steady employment. Logging was one of the major industries in northern British Columbia, and temporary work in remote camps was common. According to investigators, Ron met an unidentified man who claimed he could offer him a well-paying job at a logging camp. The stranger reportedly explained that transportation would be provided and suggested that Ron could even bring his family with him. The opportunity sounded ideal for a family looking for a fresh start, and there appeared to be little reason to suspect anything was wrong. On August 2, 1989, the Jack family prepared to leave. Witnesses later recalled seeing them gather their belongings and wait for the promised ride. The mysterious man arrived in what was described as a dark-colored pickup truck, believed by some witnesses to be a newer model. The family climbed into the vehicle, expecting to begin a journey toward a logging camp where Ron would start work. It was the last confirmed time anyone ever saw Ronald, Doreen, Russell, or Ryan Jack alive. When the family failed to return or contact relatives, concern gradually began to grow. At first, some family members assumed the logging job had simply taken them to a remote area where communication was limited. In northern British Columbia during the late 1980s, this was not entirely unusual. Logging camps were often located deep in the wilderness, far from towns, and workers sometimes spent weeks away without easy access to telephones. However, as more time passed with no letters, phone calls, or visits, relatives realized something was terribly wrong. Police eventually launched a missing person investigation. Detectives attempted to identify the logging company connected to the alleged job offer, but they quickly encountered a major problem. No legitimate company could confirm hiring Ron Jack or arranging transportation for his family. Investigators searched employment records, interviewed logging contractors, and examined reports from camps operating throughout the region. Every lead ended the same way. There was no evidence that the promised job had ever existed. The investigation soon shifted from a missing person case to a suspected homicide. Detectives concluded that the mysterious job offer may have been nothing more than a carefully designed trap to lure the family away from witnesses. The unidentified man who collected the Jacks became the central figure in the investigation. But despite numerous interviews and public appeals, his identity has never been confirmed. Witness descriptions provided only limited details, making it extremely difficult for police to determine who he was or whether he used a false name. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case is the complete absence of physical evidence. No abandoned vehicle connected to the family has ever been located. None of their belongings have been discovered in remote forests, rivers, or abandoned camps. There have been no confirmed bank transactions, government records, employment applications, or sightings indicating that any member of the family survived after that August afternoon. It is as though they simply vanished from existence the moment they entered the pickup truck. Because northern British Columbia contains millions of acres of dense forests, mountains, lakes, and isolated logging roads, search efforts faced enormous challenges. Investigators searched areas connected to possible logging operations and followed numerous tips from the public, but the vast wilderness made comprehensive searches nearly impossible. Even if evidence had existed, decades of harsh weather, wildlife activity, and changing landscapes could have erased important clues long before search teams arrived. As the years passed, investigators explored numerous theories. Some believed the family may have been targeted by someone with criminal intentions who deliberately invented the job offer. Others suggested the possibility of a dispute or personal conflict unknown to the family. There has also been speculation that organized criminal activity connected to remote work camps may somehow have played a role. although investigators have never found evidence supporting that theory. Because there is so little physical evidence, nearly every explanation remains speculative. The disappearance has had a devastating impact on the Jack family's relatives. Without bodies or definitive answers, they have lived for decades without knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones. Every anniversary of the disappearance serves as another painful reminder that Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan left home expecting a new opportunity, but never returned. Family members have repeatedly appealed to the public, hoping someone may remember details about the mysterious man or the vehicle that picked them up more than 30 years ago. In recent years, advances in investigative technology have prompted police to revisit the case. Detectives have re-examined witness statements, reviewed old files, and released age-progressed images of what the two young boys might have looked like had they survived. Although investigators have consistently stated that they believe the family likely met with foul play shortly after disappearing, authorities continue to encourage anyone with information, even details that may have seemed insignificant at the time, to come forward, believing that a single overlooked clue could finally identify the man behind the fake job offer. The Jack family case has also highlighted the vulnerability of people searching for employment in isolated industries. In remote regions where temporary work is common and opportunities often arise through word of mouth, it can be difficult to verify offers or the identities of recruiters. Investigators believe the person responsible may have taken advantage of the family's hope for stable employment, using trust as a weapon to lure them into an unknown location where no witnesses would be present. Today, more than 3 decades after Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack disappeared, the mystery remains unsolved. No one has ever been charged, no remains have ever been found, and the identity of the man who promised Ron a logging job remains unknown. The case stands as one of Canada's most haunting disappearances because of its simplicity. A family accepted what they believed was a chance for a better future, climbed into a stranger's truck, and was never seen again, until new evidence emerges or someone finally reveals what happened that summer day in 1989. The disappearance of the Jack family will remain one of British Columbia's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Stanley Park Babes in the Woods murders remain one of Canada's oldest and most heartbreaking unsolved murder cases. For decades, investigators did not even know the names of the victims, referring to them only as the Babes in the Woods. Their identities remained a mystery for nearly 70 years, turning the investigation into one of the country's most haunting cold cases. Although remarkable advances in forensic genealogy eventually revealed who the two young boys were, the identity of the person responsible for their deaths has never been discovered. The case continues to raise painful questions about family tragedy, forgotten victims, and justice delayed across generations. The story began on January 14, 1953, in Vancouver's famous Stanley Park, a sprawling urban forest known for its towering cedar trees, scenic trails, and peaceful atmosphere. On that cold winter afternoon, a man walking through a heavily wooded section of the park made a horrifying discovery. Hidden beneath a fallen log and covered with brush were the skeletal remains of 2 small children. Authorities were immediately called to the scene, and what initially appeared to be an isolated discovery soon became one of the most disturbing investigations in Canadian history. Police determined that the remains belonged to 2 young boys, estimated to be around 6 and 7 years old. Because only skeletal remains were found, investigators could not easily determine how long the children had been dead, or identify the precise cause of death. However, evidence at the scene strongly suggested that the boys had not died of natural causes. They appeared to have been deliberately concealed beneath the log, indicating that someone had attempted to hide the bodies. The careful placement of the remains convinced detectives that they were dealing with a double homicide. One of the greatest challenges facing investigators was that the boys carried no identification, no clothing labels, and no belongings that could reveal who they were. Fingerprinting was impossible because of the condition of the remains, and DNA technology would not exist for several more decades. Police distributed facial reconstructions based on the skulls, hoping someone might recognize the children. Newspapers across Canada published sketches of the boys, appealing to parents, relatives, teachers, and neighbors for information. Despite widespread publicity, no one came forward with a convincing identification. The mystery deepened as investigators searched missing person reports from across British Columbia and neighboring provinces. Surprisingly, they found no reports that clearly matched two brothers disappearing together. This absence puzzled detectives. In most child homicide cases, parents or relatives report missing children almost immediately, yet in this case, no one appeared to be searching for the victims. This unusual circumstance led investigators to consider troubling possibilities. Perhaps the boys had recently arrived from another province or another country. Perhaps their entire family had disappeared. Or perhaps the person responsible for killing them was also the person who would normally have reported them missing. As the investigation expanded, police interviewed hundreds of witnesses and examined numerous leads. Several individuals claimed to have seen two young boys playing in Stanley Park shortly before the estimated time of death, while others reported suspicious adults in the area. Detectives also investigated local families, orphanages, schools, and adoption records. Unfortunately, none of these leads produced definitive answers. Without knowing the children's identities, investigators had little foundation upon which to build a suspect list. Medical examinations suggested that the boys had died from blunt force trauma, although the exact circumstances remained difficult to determine because of the condition of the remains. The injuries indicated that the deaths were intentional and violent. Detectives believed both children had likely been killed elsewhere before their bodies were transported to the park, although they could not completely rule out the possibility that the murders occurred near the discovery site. Stanley Park's dense forests, particularly during the 1950s, provided numerous secluded locations where bodies could remain hidden for months without being discovered. Over the following years, countless theories emerged. Some investigators suspected a family member, believing the children may have been victims of domestic violence or murder-suicide involving a parent. Others considered whether the boys had been kidnapped by a stranger before being killed. There were also theories involving organized crime, illegal adoptions, and individuals suffering from severe mental illness. However, every theory suffered from the same critical problem. Without knowing who the victims were, detectives could not reconstruct their final days or identify people who had interacted with them. As decades passed, the case gradually became one of Canada's most famous cold cases. Every few years, renewed media attention generated fresh tips, but none led to a breakthrough. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to preserve evidence and revisit old files, yet the identities of the children remained unknown. The case became symbolic of the many limitations faced by investigators before the arrival of DNA analysis and computerized missing person databases. Everything changed in 2022 when modern forensic genealogy finally solved the mystery of the boys' identities. By extracting DNA from the remains and comparing it with genetic information from distant relatives, investigators successfully identified the victims as brothers Derek D'Alton, aged 7, and David D'Alton, aged 6. The discovery ended nearly 70 years of uncertainty regarding who the children were. For the first time since 1953, the babes in the woods had names, birthdays, and a family history. The identification also revealed heartbreaking details about the boys' lives. The brothers had been born into a family experiencing significant personal difficulties. Historical records showed that their parents had separated, and the children had lived under complicated family circumstances during the years leading up to their deaths. While investigators have not publicly disclosed every detail to protect surviving relatives, the identification allowed police to reconstruct parts of the family's history that had been completely unknown for decades. Although identifying the victims represented a major breakthrough, it did not solve the murders themselves. The person responsible for killing Derek and David has never been officially identified. Because so much time has passed, many potential witnesses have died, memories have faded, and crucial evidence has been lost forever. Even if investigators now develop a likely suspect, proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt after more than 70 years presents extraordinary challenges. Today, investigators continue to examine historical records, family documents, and witness accounts in hopes that identifying the boys will eventually lead to identifying their killer. Modern genealogical research, combined with renewed public interest, has opened investigative avenues that were unimaginable in the 1950s. Detectives believe that someone alive at the time may have known what happened but never came forward, either out of fear, loyalty, or uncertainty. They continue to encourage anyone with historical knowledge of the Dalton family or events surrounding the boy's disappearance to contact authorities. The Stanley Park Babes in the Woods murders remain one of Canada's most poignant unsolved mysteries because the case reflects both remarkable scientific progress and the painful limits of justice. For nearly 7 decades, the victims were known only by a nickname, their identities hidden by time. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, Derek and David D'Alton are no longer anonymous children forgotten beneath the trees of Stanley Park. Yet the central question remains unanswered. Who took the lives of 2 innocent brothers and left them hidden in the forest? Until that mystery is solved, the case will continue to stand as one of the nation's oldest and most emotionally haunting unsolved crimes. The murder of Lindsay Buziak is one of Canada's most baffling modern murder mysteries, a case that has frustrated investigators, captivated true crime enthusiasts, and sparked countless theories for more than a decade. Unlike many unsolved homicides where the victim's final moments are largely unknown, Lindsay's last appointment was carefully documented. Investigators know exactly where she was, why she was there, and even the approximate time she was killed. Yet despite this unusually clear timeline, no one has ever been arrested, no motive has been definitively established, and the 2 people believed to have orchestrated the meeting seemingly vanished without leaving behind any meaningful trace. The combination of meticulous planning, the absence of forensic evidence, and the apparent professionalism of the crime has made it one of Canada's most perplexing unsolved cases. Lindsay Buziak was a 24-year-old real estate agent living in Victoria, British Columbia. Friends and colleagues described her as ambitious, intelligent, and driven to succeed in the competitive real estate industry. She had built a reputation for being friendly and hardworking, and she was determined to establish herself in a career where trust and personal relationships were essential. Outside of work, Lindsay maintained close relationships with her family and friends, and by all accounts, she appeared to be enjoying a promising future. There was nothing in her personal life that suggested she was in immediate danger. The events leading to her death began several days before the murder. Lindsay received a phone call from a woman who spoke with what several people later described as a distinctive accent. The caller claimed she and her husband had recently moved to British Columbia and were interested in purchasing an expensive home quickly. They requested to view a vacant property in the upscale Gordon Head neighborhood of Saanich. The house, valued at nearly $1 million, fit the description of the type of property the callers claimed they wanted. Although the request seemed unusual, because the buyers appeared eager to make an immediate purchase without much negotiation, Lindsay agreed to show them the home. As the appointment approached, Lindsay reportedly expressed uneasiness about the prospective clients. According to friends and family, something about the phone calls and the buyer's behavior made her uncomfortable. She mentioned that the interaction felt unusual, although she could not clearly explain why. Because of these concerns, her boyfriend, Jason Zalo, agreed to accompany her to the property. Rather than entering the home, he planned to remain outside and wait nearby while Lindsay conducted the showing. On the afternoon of February 2nd, 2008, Lindsay arrived at the vacant house shortly before the scheduled appointment. Witnesses later reported seeing a well-dressed man and woman arrive separately and meet Lindsay outside the property. The couple appeared calm and composed. The woman was described as having dark hair and speaking with an accent, while the man was neatly dressed and accompanied her without attracting attention. Nothing about their behavior suggested the violence that would soon occur. After a brief conversation, Lindsay unlocked the front door and escorted the couple inside. Minutes passed in silence. Jason remained outside, expecting Lindsay to finish the property tour and emerge after showing the house. However, when she failed to return within a reasonable amount of time, concern began to grow. Jason attempted to contact her, but received no response. Eventually, he entered the home along with another individual to check on her. What they discovered was horrifying. Lindsay was lying inside the residence, having suffered multiple stab wounds. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. The 24-year-old realtor was pronounced dead at the scene. The brutality of the attack immediately suggested that the murder had been carefully planned. Investigators determined that Lindsay had been stabbed repeatedly in what appeared to be a swift and deliberate assault. Surprisingly, there were no signs that valuable property had been stolen, no indication of a sexual assault, and very little evidence of a prolonged struggle. The killers appeared to have entered the home with a single objective: to murder Lindsay Buziak. Once the attack was complete, they disappeared before anyone nearby realized what had happened. Police launched one of the largest homicide investigations in British Columbia's history. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined thousands of documents, and analyzed telephone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods. They carefully reconstructed Lindsay's final hours and sought to identify every person who had communicated with her before the appointment. Yet despite these extensive efforts, investigators encountered an extraordinary obstacle. The suspects had left almost no physical evidence behind. Forensic specialists searched the crime scene extensively for fingerprints, DNA, shoe impressions, fibers, and trace evidence. While some forensic material was collected, none led investigators to a definitive suspect. The killers appeared to have taken precautions that suggested planning and experience. The vacant home offered few opportunities for witnesses, and the timing of the appointment minimized the chance of interruption. Investigators became increasingly convinced that the murder had not been spontaneous, but instead had been orchestrated well in advance. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding the case is the identity of the couple who arranged the viewing. Witnesses provided descriptions, and police produced composite sketches based on those accounts. Despite nationwide publicity, no one has ever been positively identified as either the man or the woman who accompanied Lindsay into the house. Investigators believe the names and contact information used to arrange the appointment were likely false, making it difficult to trace their true identities. It remains unclear whether the two individuals personally committed the murder or simply lured Lindsay into the house for someone else waiting inside. As investigators searched for a motive, numerous theories emerged. Some believed Lindsay may have been targeted because of her work in real estate, although police have never found evidence that a property transaction directly led to the crime. Others suggested the possibility that she unknowingly possessed information valuable to dangerous individuals. There has also been speculation about links to organized crime, particularly because of reports that some people within Lindsay's wider social circle had indirect associations with individuals involved in drug trafficking. However, investigators have repeatedly stated that no publicly available evidence has conclusively established organized crime as the motive. Another theory proposes that Lindsay herself was never the intended target, but rather became a victim because of someone she knew. According to this possibility, the killers may have used her appointment simply as a means of sending a message to another individual. Others believe the murder was deeply personal, arguing that the precision of the attack indicates someone who specifically wanted Lindsay dead. Despite years of investigation, police have never publicly endorsed any single theory as the definitive explanation. The case has also generated criticism regarding certain aspects of the investigation. Lindsay's family has been outspoken in urging authorities to continue pursuing new leads and has expressed frustration over the lack of arrests. They have organized awareness campaigns, maintained public attention through media appearances, and encouraged anyone with information to come forward. Their determination has helped ensure that the investigation remains active despite the passage of time. Advances in forensic science have periodically renewed hope that the mystery could eventually be solved. Detectives continue to review preserved evidence using improved DNA analysis, digital forensic techniques, and new investigative technologies unavailable in 2008. Cold case investigators have revisited witness statements, examined anonymous tips, and reassessed earlier assumptions. Each technological advancement offers the possibility that a previously overlooked clue could finally reveal the identities of the killers. Today, more than 18 years after Lindsay Buziak walked into that vacant house, expecting to show a property to prospective buyers, her murder remains officially unsolved. The case stands apart from many other cold cases because investigators possess an unusually detailed timeline, eyewitness descriptions of the suspects, and a clearly identified crime scene, yet still lack the evidence necessary to identify or prosecute those responsible. Every element of the crime suggests careful planning, deception, and an escape executed with remarkable precision. The murder of Lindsay Buziak continues to haunt Canada because it feels so close to being solved, yet remains just beyond reach. Somewhere, someone knows why a young real estate agent was lured into an empty home under the false promise of a lucrative sale. Somewhere, the identities of the mysterious couple, and perhaps others involved, remain hidden behind years of silence. Until that silence is broken or new evidence finally emerges, the killing of Lindsay Buziak will remain one of Canada's most chilling and enduring unsolved murder mysteries.